So welcome everybody to panel 3 of Crediton Literary Festival, brackets, online, close brackets for the second year running. You are all very welcome to the historical panel, Forgotten Voices, featuring these 5 lovely authors that you see on your screen in front of you. Louise Fein, author of People Like Us, Polly Crosby, author of The Illustrated Child, Frances Quinn, author of The Smallest Man, Louise Hare, author of This Lovely City, and Nikki Marmery, author of On Wilder Seas. I will let all of you talk about your own books in just a moment, and more importantly, and don't be shy about it, all of the prizes that you have won for various of these books, either a little while ago or somewhat more recently in some cases. Talk about the email that says, I've just won this, but don't tell anybody yet, because, or I've just been shortlisted for this, but don't tell anybody yet because I'm not allowed to. I knew before everybody else. It's like a feeling of power. Okay, do all enjoy learning about historical fiction with this wonderful panel. Louise, it is over to you.
Thank you so much, Mark, for inviting me to have this chat this morning. Mark's introduced us all, so I think what we'll do first is just talk a little bit about our books. I'm the author of People Like Us, which is a historical fiction novel set in 1930s Leipzig. It's essentially a love story, which is about a young girl who's been brainwashed into Nazism, who falls in love with a young Jewish boy. But it's more than just a love story. It's also about the brainwashing of a nation. I'm also going to talk, sorry, plugging 2 books, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about my book that's coming out in September, which is called The Hidden Child. And it's set in the 1920s and is about, essentially about the eugenics movement. The epilepsy colonies which were around at that time. I'm going to ask Polly to introduce herself and her novel next.
Hello, I'm Polly Crosby. I'm the author of The Illustrated Child, which came out last October, and that's out in paperback in July. And I'm going to do what Louise did and talk about my second novel as well, because this is the historical novel, which is so new. Although it's got a cover, it doesn't actually have an actual book yet because it's not out till September. It's called The Unravelling, and it's about a young woman who takes a position as PA to a lepidopterist, a butterfly collector, on a wild and mysterious island in the North Sea.
Nikki.
Yes, I'm Nikki Marmery. I'm the author of, check that's in page, yep, On Wilder Seas. And this is a book about a real person called Maria. And she was the woman who was on board the Golden Hind during Francis Drake's circumnavigation voyage. And she joined the ship. She's from a Spanish merchant ship which Drake met off the coast of Mexico. And he, as he did whenever he came across a Spanish ship or a port, he raided the ship, took valuables, food, a pilot to get him to his next port, and also, for the first and only time in his career, he took a woman as well, this woman Maria, and she was on board the Golden Hind during this incredibly famous exploration voyage. She was there for Drake's exploration of North America. She lived ashore for 5 weeks with Drake and his crew at the colony that he founded in North America. She crossed the Pacific with them, and then she was left abandoned on a desert island in Indonesia, by which point she was very heavily pregnant. And my book is about Maria's story. It's about her life and her experiences in this, really quite shocking facts of her life.
Great, thank you, Nikki. Phoebe.
Sorry. So this is my book, This Lovely City, which is out in paperback now. And this is it's a murder mystery, but there's a bit of a love story there as well. So it's about my characters Laurie and Evie. It's just after World War II, so it's 1950s London, and Laurie arrived in the UK on the Empire Windrush. has fallen in love with the girl next door, and everything is turning out brilliantly for them until he makes a gruesome discovery as he's crossing Clapham Common one day. So it's about how the pair of them get involved in this sort of murder investigation, and also about the community that they are sort of growing up in that part of South London at that time.
Brilliant, thanks Louise. And last but definitely not least, Frances.
So this is my book, The Smallest Man. It's probably set furthest back perhaps than all of us, or no, I think Nikki's is earlier. It's set in 17th century England and based on a true story, and it tells the story of a boy with dwarfism who's sold by his father, and he's given as a present to the Queen and becomes a court dwarf at the court of Charles I. He's 10 years old, the new Queen is just 15. He's very homesick, she's very homesick, she's a French princess, she's come to England, she doesn't even speak the language, and they strike up an unlikely friendship just as the country is beginning to slide into what will be the English Civil War, and their friendship takes them through those very turbulent years.
Brilliant, thank you. So as you can see, we've got novels covering a wide time period and a really wide range of subject matter. Also told from perspectives of people not often heard from in history. So we've got the point of view of a female slave, we've got newly arrived immigrants, we've got someone with a disability, and we've got, is it oyster collectors? And
Yes.
I can't even say it.
Lepidoptery, yes.
So, you know, not often heard of in fiction. And from my side, again, people with disability who were hidden away from 1920. So I'm really interested to know what drew each of you to your particular subject matter. So Polly, let's start with you.
Well, The Unravelling is set on a very wild island. I love nature, and in particular, I love how humans change nature and work with nature to make it useful to them. The Unravelling features lepidoptery, butterfly collecting, oyster cultivation for pearls, and silkworm creation, silk baking. And so there are lots of different animals, insects being used for humans and being changed by humans to help them. And that's happened throughout our history over centuries and still happens now, obviously. And I just think it's fascinating seeing how humans adapt nature for their own use.
Yeah, and not always to their benefit or with unforeseen circumstances.
Indeed.
And how did you go about researching? Because, you know, research, you know, well-known topics, but with something like that, I can imagine there was some problems.
Yes, well, I'm from Suffolk, and the book is based in Suffolk, and there's a lot of rich local history about all of these things. So I, as always, as I think most of us do, I went to books first and got lots of research there. Initially I read a book called The Rings of Saturn by W.G. Seybold, who is a walking tour of Suffolk, but it includes little pieces of history throughout human time. And that was a brilliant starting point. But the local museums have always been brilliant because they always feature local topics and local subjects, and they know them in such depth. So that's where I mined a lot of my information from. Brilliant,
thank you. And Nikki, I mean, your book sound, I haven't read it yet. It's on the top of my list, and I can't stand it. But again, with going far back in time and with particularly a perspective of a female slave who wouldn't have had anything with them, that must have caused some problems. So yeah, what was your what drove you to that story, and how did you feel about your research?
Yeah, well, it was Maria really who drew me to the story. You know, I've had a sort of probably a lifelong interest with Drake and exploration. You know, I'd visited the replica of the Golden Hind as a child, And so it just struck me that I was quite old when I discovered that there was in fact a woman on board this ship, an African woman. She was her situation is actually incredibly ambiguous. So we don't know, but yes, she was probably enslaved when Drake met her on the Spanish merchant ship. So it was her that really fascinated me. I wanted to know everything about her. And as you say, of course, there isn't much to find out about her. There are facts, but not very many. There are eyewitness accounts of her, but they are very biased, and they objectify her, and they talk about her in a way that doesn't give any information about her humanity. So that's really what drew me to the subject, and particularly actually the way she's described by historians over the past 500 years. We've known about this woman since Drake returned from his circumnavigation voyage in 1580, and yet she's most of the time she's not mentioned at all in histories of Drake and this very famous voyage. If she is mentioned, her name isn't even mentioned, even though we know what it is. And there are a lot of assumptions about her that, in fact, when you look into the primary sources, are not, they are just that, assumptions. There's nothing to sort of base these things on. So that's what drew me to it. And I had to be quite creative in how I found out about what her life would have been like, because there isn't any actual information. And the way I did that was to look at lives, women who led lives like hers. So the stories of women of African descent in Mexico and across the Spanish New World. And astonishingly, there is a lot of information about these women because, unfortunately, because of the Spanish Inquisition. They were quite often hauled up, for bigamy or blasphemy or heresy or witchcraft. And in those situations, the records, they always recorded people in their own voices. So it means that there is quite a lot of information about women who lived lives like Maria's, speaking in their own words, which is incredible because you get a much bigger sense of them as people, what they thought and how they spoke. So that was a real turning point for me, and that's how I sort of built my understanding of Maria and what her life would have been like, how she felt and spoke.
Sorry to interrupt, but was that in Spanish, Nikki?
Well, luckily there's plenty of translated material because I do not speak Spanish. So there are, I'm piggybacking really on the work of historians who've done all of this work, who have scoured the archives for these stories and published them. This is a fantastic resource while we're on the subject, which is all about lives like this in Mexico and across the Spanish New World. Sorry, I should mention Afro-Latino Voices by Catherine Joy McKnight and Leo J. Garofalo. So you can find this information, and when you read people in their own words, you just get a much more, you find things that you just wouldn't have found out otherwise. You find much more fascinating stories. You see people with agency where you might not necessarily have thought they had much power in their situation, and so that's really what drew me to Maria and kept me going, because I found those lives fascinating and little known.
Amazing, thank you, Nikki. I mean, I guess you were saying that once you start digging, you then find little bits. You can go down a lot of rabbit holes.
Yeah. Get lost.
But there is an incredible amount of information, not just on the internet, but in books, in libraries. She says, giving a plug for libraries, but yeah, amazing resources if you start digging. Yeah. So Frances, as someone also who's written quite a long time in history, again, what drew you to write this particular story, and how easy was it to find information? But I mean, obviously information about the time period, but about your particular subject matter.
So I kind of stumbled across the real life story that was the inspiration for my character, Nat Davey, and the real person was called Geoffrey Hudson. And I stumbled across him quite by accident. I was researching a completely different book that never saw the light of day. And I wanted a 17th century character with a disability, just to give a kind of different perspective on events. Stumbled across the Wikipedia entry for Geoffrey Hudson. who was the court dwarf at the court, or one of the court dwarfs at the court of Charles I, had the most incredible life. And by the time I got to the end of the Wikipedia page, I just thought, how has nobody put this guy in a novel? He had such adventures, and although there was nothing in his words, just the character just leapt off the page. So that was that. I had the idea, and this was great. And then I was very lucky because, in a way, a bit like Nikki's character, he's a witness to quite important historical events, but he's on the edge of it. You know, mostly people are not, he's mentioned here and there, or the Queen's dwarf was present, blah, blah, blah. But there was one biography of him. So I was, as Nikki said, able to piggyback a bit on the research that was done for that. But because he's a minor character, it's bits here and there stitched together, and then there's gaps of, we don't know what happened between this decade and that decade. So I had a kind of framework, and then I had to fill in a lot of gaps. And the tricky things were odd things. So when Nat first arrives at the palace, I couldn't find out what the Queen's dwarf would be doing all day. I couldn't find out what the Queen would be doing all day. And I searched and searched and searched. When did they get up in the morning? What did they do then? When did they eat their dinner? And in the end, you just kind of have to get the fragments and assemble what you think might have happened, because you kind of think, well, if nobody wrote it down, nobody else knows either. And you just kind of have to imagine it. So it's things like that that I think can send you down the rabbit hole. You know, you can lose a day. I've lost a day to do the, did they have pockets in their trousers in the 17th century?
And that little detail kind of matters, doesn't it, when you're writing and you want to create the authenticity. But at the end of the day, and that is why we're writing historical fiction, because the fiction part fills in the gaps. And as long as it's sort of authentic, I think you can not get away with it's the wrong word, but you have to use some imagination. But it's incredible, isn't it, that even the Queen, who was a pretty important person, that isn't documented.
No, because I guess it's one of those things that everyone writing at the time knew. You know, if we were writing about our lives now, we probably wouldn't say, I got up and turned the radio on, because we take it as read. So nobody bothered to write that stuff down.
Points, yeah. And Louise, I mean, obviously your book is more up to date, so presumably there's more information. But again, there must be aspects that you have to imagine along the way. But and what drew you to write your story?
Yeah, so Windrush period was actually a period that I didn't want to write about. I wanted to write about Black British history before that, because I stupidly thought everyone knew about Windrush already, and everyone had read Small Island, and why would I want to, piggyback on and all of that kind of stuff that people already know. I'd like to explore sort of more forgotten characters in Black British history. But what really drew me to this story was doing a tour. So at Clapham South Tube Station in South London, there is a deep level shelter, and you could do, well, you can't at the moment, hopefully you will be able to do again. You can do tours into the shelter, which I knew had been used during World War II as an air raid shelter. But it wasn't until I actually got down there that they had sort of pictures and information about other uses, which included housing Windrush passengers when they first arrived in 1948. And I was sort of down there, you can hear all the trains going past, and it's just such an alien environment. You feel like you've been in a spaceship. So you've just got these huge, long tunnels. Like there's one bit where they take you in and it's pitch black, and then they just flip the lights on. And it's kind of like a bit of a Doctor Who episode where the light used to go boom, 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 and it's all these lights going down all this way down this huge, long tunnel. And it's so scary. And I was just thinking, imagine you've traveled all this way, you've never left home before, you arrive in this country that you've learned about your entire life because you were a British subject, but it's nothing like how you were shown in pictures. And then they shove you into these crazy tunnels underground. And I just thought, my God, like, what would that have felt like? You must be thinking, how do I get back home? So that's how I came up with Laurie. And I wrote it as a short story, but then I was studying for a master's at the time in creative writing, and the feedback in the class was, but what happens to Laurie after that? Which is this novel. So yeah, I mean, I guess the good thing about writing about 1950 and 1948 is that it's such a well-documented period. There's quite a lot of books that will tell you exactly what stage of rationing it was in 1948 and 1950, because my book covers both periods and there were changes within those periods. There are still some women with passengers alive, and there's lots of first-person accounts. I turned to fiction first of all, actually. So the two books that I read first were The Lonely Londoners by Sam Selvin and To Serve With Love by E.R. Braithwaite, which is also a film, because they were written by people that sort of lived that life. They arrived, I think E.R. Braithwaite also fought in the RAF during World War II. And so they went through those experiences that I was trying to sort of portray in the book. So it was, although they're fiction, they are novels. It was sort of getting that almost first person perspective on what it was actually like at the time.
It sounds absolutely horrific. The whole putting them all underground, and they were actually asked to come over, and yeah, amazing. Anyway, thank you. And yeah, for my side, my first book, People Like Us, was really inspired by my family history. My father had come over from Leipzig as a refugee in the 1930s, but he never ever spoke about his experiences, and he died when I was only 17, so I never really got the chance to talk to him about it. So it had always been something I wanted to explore, and it was always going to be fiction. I didn't know enough about family history to write anything else really, but yeah, so for me it was a bit of a personal journey of sort of going to Leipzig, walking around the area that he lived in, and meeting with sort of experts on that period of time, and just listening to personal accounts. But I think what I really tried to do was to get contemporaneous information, because especially with a period like the Second World War in the 1930s, it's so, when you look back on it, you've got that perspective of, we all know what happened, we all know about the Holocaust, and I wanted to be in the shoes of somebody who didn't know what was, and that's quite a different perspective. So when people read the book, they might think he's very naive, but of course everybody was, because no one knew what was going to come, and that was what was really important to me with that book. So moving on, did any of you in the course of your research uncover anything that was sort of surprising or shocking or something totally unexpected? Don't worry if you didn't, but how about you, Nikki?
Absolutely, loads of stuff. I mean, I had sort of preconceptions about what life would have been like for the people I was writing about, and they went out the window once you start reading, first-person accounts of people's lives. I've mentioned already that some of the accounts of women that you can be glimpsed at through the Inquisition records, and these, some of those stories are astonishing. Women, an enslaved woman, being hauled up not once but twice for accusations of witchcraft, who manages to win. That's who knew there were stories like that. Stories that are just incredible like that. Women doing incredible things. Women who had freed themselves from slavery and then ended up leaving wills that showed that they had been able to build up inheritances that they then left to people. Wonderful stories like that, stories of women, with power and agency out of situations that you just could not possibly have imagined that would have been the case. And again, you saw the stories of the resistance to slavery as well. I don't think we hear enough about those stories, because they're the ones that are so inspiring and hopeful. There's a character in my novel called Diego, who is what was called a cimarron, and these were the fugitives from slavery in the Spanish New World who fought back. And in Mexico, there's fantastic history of those stories and winning. Diego was partially responsible for Drake's entire first fortune. It was his sort of collaboration with Diego and Diego's contacts with the other cimarrons in Mexico that enabled him to make his first fortune, which is just, fantastic. And that brought me to all these stories of these other sort of great resistors. The story of Gaspar Yanga, who fought back. He set up a town of free Maroons in Mexico, that had hundreds of people on it, an entirely free city for escaped slaves. So stories like that, amazing, astonishing stories that I think we don't hear enough of, and which sort of I wanted to work into my novel.
Brilliant, thank you. Really fascinating stuff. What about you, Polly?
Gosh, slightly different note to Nikki's incredible findings there. Because my novel is so intertwined between humans and animals, some of the things I found out there surprised me with how much we have changed animals and insects and things. One thing I discovered, the family on my island are silk makers. So they cultivate silkworms, and then the silkworms hatch into silk moths, and they mate and lay eggs, and it carries on. And the silkworms then spin cocoons, and that's the silk that we get for clothes. And one scene I had written involved some silk moths flying around a room because they'd hatched and were about to escape. And after I'd done my research, I realized that although they have hugely strong, powerful wings, they can't actually fly because we've bred them over so many hundreds of years that they've just lost that ability. So they just are born, they go through the rhythms of making their cocoons, they hatch, they mate, and they die. And I think that really made me realize just how much we have done and just how much we do now to change the world we live in. It's not just about us, it's how we orchestrate the whole thing, really. And that really surprised me.
Wow, amazing. So there's no sort of wild silkworms or anything?
You do get, there are many different breeds of silk moth, but the type that we have domesticated, which is a great word, isn't it? You don't think of a moth being domesticated. Yeah, they have a very basic job and they do it extremely well still.
Amazing. Louise, anything from your side?
Yeah, well, weirdly, the most surprising thing that I discovered wasn't anything to do with the actual research. It was, as I said before, the reason I didn't want to write about Windrush is I thought everyone knew all about it. And actually what happened was, as I finished writing the book, the Windrush scandal happened. And I discovered that loads of people didn't know anything about Windrush at all, including people that actually live in Brixton and walk past Windrush Square every day. And they thought it was a nice name. Didn't really understand, what any of it was about. So yeah, I guess it just goes back to don't make assumptions about what other people know when you're writing historical fiction. It didn't change any of the book, but it did make me sort of reinforce a few things. I wanted to make sure people understood that Laurie had a British passport and different things like that were sort of made the scandal as big as it was, essentially.
Yeah, still going on as well. And what about you, France?
Yeah, for me, it's the funny little stories that you come across when you research and that you suddenly realise you can use. So one that I found was once the Civil War kind of starts bubbling up, the Queen goes off to Holland to try and drum up arms and ammunition for the King, and she's kind of trapped there for about a year. And when she sails back, they land at Bridlington in the north of England, and they go to bed. And then at midnight that night, the port comes under bombardment from parliamentarian ships, and they all have to run off and hide. And as they run off, she suddenly realizes she's got this little dog that goes everywhere with her, and she's left the dog behind in the cottage where they were staying, and she runs back for it. And that was such a, I would have liked to make that up, but actually I didn't need to. And then that scene, it tells you something about her, and then how Nat, the main character, reacts to it, tells you something about him as well. So those kind of little things are a gift, and they sometimes come when you're thinking, oh God, what happens next? What am I gonna put in this scene? And then you find these little gems, and a whole other story unfolds.
Real insight into her character, and it's very modern as well, the sort of thing I might do. And yeah, for me, I'm going to talk a little bit about my second book, because the 1920s sort of doesn't feel that long ago. I know it's 100 years ago, but in a lot of ways it still feels quite modern. And I think when I was doing my research into the colonies and the attitudes at the time, I was quite horrified by how much eugenics influenced government policy, the whole education system. So one of my main characters is based on a real person, a guy called Sir Cyril Burt, who was a raging eugenicist, like a lot of people were. Winston Churchill, you know, Virginia Woolf, enormous characters of the time. And he believed that intelligence was 100% inherited. And so he did these intelligence tests, which actually were started in the US as a way of testing US recruits for the army. And he adapted them to try and just basically it was very classist. So he in his mind, anyone born of the sort of middle or professional upwards classes were naturally more intelligent than anyone of the lower orders or the sort of the working classes. And so the idea was to have schools, grammar schools for the wealthier children, and this sort of, you know, influenced the whole education system in the country, based on a science that is completely false. So I just found that really quite fascinating. And the other thing that was really poignant and sad was looking at the case notes from asylums and epilepsy colonies, where tiny children were taken and put in these places never to come out again. And I read of one little girl who was about 4 or 5, who her mother told her she was going to go and stay in this children's home overnight and she'd pick her up the next day. And 70 years later, she was still there and never visited by him. And that was, you know, quite common. And as I was going through these books and you'd have these pictures of these people, I just felt like I needed to give them all a little bit of time, because, you know, the way the notes were written was at best matter of fact, and at worst really uncaring. And, oh, this person crying for no good reason. And actually, she was like an 18-year-old girl who'd had a baby, and the baby had been taken away from her, and, you know, really locked her away in a room. And there was just very little humanity, and I felt like owed something to these people who just forgotten. So yeah, that's what I found. So in a lot of our novels, sense of place is really important, and obviously you can go to play, well, in normal times you can go to places and see them, but knowing what that place was like in a historic sense, and getting the, you know, the smells and the taste and the sensory side is quite challenging from a historical perspective. So I'm intrigued to know how you guys went about that. So Louise, how did you tackle that side of it? Because London is obviously a really, I mean, I live in London, but it's quite a big character in your book.
Yeah, I literally did try and treat the city as a character, and because I live in South London, not too far from where my book is set, it was quite easy to go and sort of walk around and look at the buildings. So I did pick specific buildings to highlight. So for example, and some of them have changed use even since I wrote the book. So I used Arding and Hobbs department store, Clapham Junction, as there's quite an important scene between Laurie and Evie that happens in the restaurant there, just because I think it's such a beautiful room, and it has this sort of glass sort of cupola, and it's, you know, it's just sort of an iconic building. And when I wrote the book, it was Debenhams. Obviously there is no Debenhams anymore, so even since the book was published, that building is now going through a change of use, you know, as we speak. I'm still not sure what they're going to do with it. So it was sort of going around and sort of looking at what I could pick out. So another key one was the Lyceum Theatre, which is where the show Fein came. I think it's been on for about 20 years now. But that was a sort of a dance hall at that time, just after the war. So that was, again, it's sort of picking things that fit with your book. So I've got a character who's a musician. So why would his band not play at this dance hall? It just gave me an excuse to sort of set that scene and set a couple of chapters there. So yeah, I had it quite easy because obviously it's not set that long ago. It is quite easy to go around and just look at the buildings and know that they would have been there at that time or not. Whereas I think going back further, I would have struggled a lot more.
But you have also done a brilliant job. I should say that you was shortlisted for a literature prize for a strong sense of place. So
yeah, I was very happy with that shortlisting because it was so important to me. So yeah.
And Polly, your island, I believe, is not a real island, but it's based on something.
Yes, it's a fictional island. Because I grew up in Suffolk and now live in Norfolk, I've got a real passion for this wide-skied landscape we have around here. I think for me, as with Louise, the island itself, like Louise's London, is a character in itself. And the main house on the island, which is the only house there, is a character too. And the sea is a character because they're such huge parts of the story and they have such meaning and they have such character in themselves. I grew up by the sea and I just remember standing on the beach one day in Walberswick in Suffolk and looking out and thinking, imagine if there was an island out there, and what would it be like? And one day I went to Orford Ness, which is a long shingle spit land owned by the National Trust. And it's got this really fascinating history about from World War II and the Cold War, and prior to that, fishing, herring fishing. And now it's been left to rewild. And I, again, like my obsession with animals and insects and how humans have changed the way they go, I was really interested in how humans leave their mark on places. So yeah, that was what it was all about, really.
And Nikki, I can imagine the sea is a pretty big character in your book as well.
Yes, yeah, well, I was faced with an absolutely huge task in terms of sense of place because my book takes in pretty much the whole world. It sort of takes in, the backstory is West Africa, then the voyage, you've got South America, there's parts in Peru, in Chile, in Mexico, in the far north, because it goes up to Alaska, and then across the sea, and it ends in the East Indies. So I was faced with a whopping task, really. And the thing that connects them all is this tiny, tiny ship. So, to sort of get a sense of place there, I mean, I already know the wonderful replica of the Golden Hind, which is at Southwark. So I already had a sort of a sense of that sort of tiny, tiny space and how cramped and crowded it would have been. And on top of that, I read a lot of accounts of Elizabethan voyages, and there are more than you might think. Of these wonderful, wonderful accounts. One of which I lent on quite heavily. It was written by, it was the journal kept by a chaplain on a later voyage, a few years after Drake's circumnavigation. And I based quite a lot of the character of Fletcher, the chaplain in my book, on this extraordinary man, because his journals give you this incredible sense of the claustrophobia, the fear, because you're in danger all the time. Half of the people on these voyages died before they got home. The sort of irritation of the other people you're stuck with, that sort of, he writes about them wonderfully. He gives them all nicknames and he laughs at them, and he hates most of them, and he describes their horrible habits. So, that gave me a real sense of the ship. But I had another massive problem because I was writing about places and people that haven't left written records. So there's a large chunk of my book that's set in what is now the Pacific North American coast. And so I was writing about the colony that Drake founded there, which was among the Native American populations there. And we don't have written accounts of their life, their lifestyle at that time. And of course, since then, they have those people have been almost completely obliterated by colonization. So we don't have accurate accounts. And what I turned to for those parts of the book was more myth and folklore, because I think you can get a good understanding of place and culture and how people feel by the myths and folklore they have, because it gives you a sense of, you know, what they ate, what was important to them, what the landscape, you know, there's a lot of talk in North American, wonderful North American myths, you know, about the importance of salmon, and that gives you sort of an idea of why, you know, why the sort of the coming of the salmon every year is so important. It gives you sort of a sense for all those things that help you build up an understanding of different cultures if you can't, if there aren't any actual records or historical resources that you would otherwise have gone to. So yeah, they were very valuable to me, but there were so many different places to describe. It was a massive feat.
Yeah, and Frances, your book, you are absolutely immersed in that time period, and you do the sensory side of it so well. So how did you know, find out how it smelt and felt and at the time?
Yeah, and it's interesting. You can there are a certain amount of first person accounts. There are quite a lot of letters going backwards and forwards from diplomats and people like that who would talk about you know, London was very smelly and so on. But a lot of it, I think you just have to kind of place yourself there and think, well, what would that be like? So I think one of the places that's most important is in the first part of the book. Nat is living in Whitehall Palace, which obviously doesn't exist anymore. There's just a banqueting hall left. But it was almost like a village in itself. There were about 2,000 people living there. And someone like Nat probably would have spent most of his time there. So London, in fact, down, you know, half an hour down the river was considered a different place. It wasn't somewhere that you just strolled to. So at one point he goes outside, and that's when he realizes the terrible fury there is about the king and queen and what's going on with Parliament. And that comes as a complete shock to him, because he's been in this little bubble, and within this bubble everybody knows each other. So for example, there's someone who basically victimizes him and bullies him, and he decides, well, I'll just keep out of his way. But he can't keep out of his way because they're all in this bubble. And so I tried to get across this very claustrophobic place where they all live, where it's sort of like a tiny village, but worse, because you can't get out of it. So yeah, I tried to get across what it feels like to just see the same faces every day, and not, because he's basically at that stage of the game, he's a human pet. He's got very little agency. He is where the Queen tells him to be. So I tried to get more that sense really of what it would feel like to be in a place like that. And then I think the other place that was very strong for me is in the last part of the book. He's in Kent, and it's at the time when, at that time, the parliamentarians were in charge of Kent. The war wasn't quite over. The fighting had stopped. There was lots of negotiations going on, but effectively in Kent, it was Cromwellian rule. And there was very much that feeling, a bit like in People Like Us, of don't say the wrong thing in front of the wrong person. Neighbours are going to rat on you. Make sure you talk the right talk. And so again, it was claustrophobic, but in a different way. So yeah, I think it's all about creating the atmosphere of not so much what a place is like, but what a place was like at that particular time.
Definitely. And in my first Leipzig, for me, the only way I could do that very well was to actually spend time walking around where my characters would have been, and because my characters couldn't meet up in public place, they spent a lot of time in the countryside, so sort of by a river or in the woods or hidden away. So I kind of walked around a lot. I did a lot of steps when I was around all the different areas. So I don't know how I would write that book at the moment, because I can't go anywhere. But that was really, really good. Also, all photographs. You know, you're at a time period, writing in a time period when there are photographs, they can be incredibly helpful. Just looking at the background, you know, behind figures and seeing what people are wearing and all that kind of thing is really helpful. And so before, so I'm just slightly conscious of time. So I just wanted to cover one more issue, which was about writing about sensitive people. Obviously, we're all writing at a time period when people had very different attitudes, some of which are quite, unacceptable and horrific today. So you're sort of plotting a course between making it acceptable for a modern readership, but being authentic at the time. And I'd just love to hear how you have tackled that and found a way through. So maybe we can start with Louise.
Yeah, so I mean, so the obvious sort of sensitive topic in my book is racism, which, it's been quite interesting actually seeing how the reception to the book has changed over, so it was published in March 2020, and then seeing what happened obviously with events of April and May 2020, so things like George Floyd. I think I've actually changed people's attitudes when they read the book. So when it was first published, a lot of people were like, oh, I don't really like reading about racism, it's it's outdated, it doesn't happen anymore. Whereas I think people have realized since, all these protests and people have actually become a little bit more informed. People are thinking, oh, actually, no, this is actually still going on. And it was quite important for me to reflect that in the book. So it is historical. And I thought I'd really sort of, I was slightly worried I'd sort of made it a little bit too sort of soft in the approach, but then maybe it's quite a hard thing to get the balance right, because you want to show that racism exists. I think it's important to the story, it's important to the characters, it's important to the plot, because it kind of doesn't make sense without that being there, and it needs to be authentic, as you were saying. But I don't want to put people off. It's not a gritty novel by any means. I mean, I think if you read Colson Whitehead or Marlon James, I think you would be a lot more shocked by the language that they use. So I didn't want to go down that route. But, a lot of the experiences that my characters have in the book are things that have happened to me or happened to people that I know. So there's nothing in there that I think is, there to be salacious or to get a rise out of people. It's just there to show the situation.
It's done really well. It's done sort of subtly, but it's there all the time, just in the way that, without giving away any plot issues. The new arrivals are the first to be suspected of any crime, etc. So it's inherent in the book.
And it's something that happens to all new communities, I think, as well, not just this particular Black community, but we still see it going on. So
and from sorry, just on the racist issue in People Like Us, I've tackled it slightly different, because my book is told from the perspective of the bad guys in a way. So it's told from the perspective of somebody who believes in the Nazi dream, and the book is her finding out the reality. And I think it's, today with all our social media sort of silos and the way people learn about, they take on the attitudes of people around them, it's important to remember that we're all brainwashed in a way, and to think about the way we talk about other people. I suppose that's really behind the reason why I chose to tell it that way, but it's a risk, because the early parts of the book are quite off-putting in terms of the attitudes of the people, but so far it's gone down all right. So yeah, and Frances.
Yeah, I guess I was lucky in a way, in that my main character, he's the one who suffers from the bad attitude. So I didn't have the tricky job that you had of making the baddies understandable in any way. So in that respect, it was easy. But I think what I wanted to try and get across was, yes, Nat's probably treated much worse because of the time he lives in, but I didn't want anyone to go away from the book thinking, oh, it's fine, that wouldn't happen now. Because no, probably someone with dwarfism wouldn't be kept as a human pet, but the attitudes are not necessarily very different. So because the story is told in first person, so I tried to get across some of the almost universal feelings about being disabled or really being different in any way. And at one point Nat says, you know, if you're different from everybody else, there's a kind of glass wall between you and them, even between you and the people who love you, because they can't ever really understand what it's like to be you. And you know, there will be those conversations of, poor so-and-so, I wouldn't like to be like that. Well, that's the same now as it was then. So I kind of hope by telling the story in first person, maybe it just might make people think about that and realise that, you know, when they give that casual sideways glance to someone, that person might get that every day, but they're still not used to it. They still don't like it, and you still shouldn't do it.
Definitely brilliant. And Nikki?
Yeah, I hadn't sort of originally, I hadn't set out to write a book about slavery, but of course it's really integral to this subject, so it couldn't be avoided. And what I wanted to do again was to go back to the sources to find out how people really did think, rather than, you know, how you might assume they do. And again, I think it's very surprising. You know, the way we, you know, racism as we know it and recognise today is a legacy of slavery, not the other way around. You know, slavery was immensely profitable. People did it because they made a lot of money out of it, and the racism developed to justify it. You know, to say, you know, this idea of there being inferior races, that is a product of slavery. So going back to, you know, what I was writing about before all of that, things are very different, and you do see that it's very different when you look at people's attitudes in, you know, what was written at the time. So there are plenty of people at this time who thought that slavery was awful and terrible. There were plenty of people who thought that Drake was a real rotter. You know, that wasn't an unusual position to take. And the first person you ever, Maria, the first mention of Maria in print actually is in 1610, and that is in a book written by the historian William Camden, and his assessment of what happened to her was that Drake had behaved inhumanely. So, you know, sometimes you find that people didn't actually think that differently to us today. And, you know, things aren't always as you sort of expect them to be. So I wanted to get that across in the book, that there were different attitudes to what was going on, and not everyone thought it was okay. And I sort of put a lot of those thoughts into the chaplain, Fletcher, who is on the boat, because he sort of throughout the course of my book, he's got a real problem with Drake and what he's doing and how he's behaving, you know, in ways that actually we would recognise as being, he's behaving a bit like a terrorist, you know, just turn up into various Spanish ports and, you know, firebomb them, go steal whatever he wanted, desecrate their churches, and then leave. You know, this is behaviour that we would recognise as being that of a terrorist today. And, you know, Fletcher thought that at the time as well. And there's a bit towards the end of my book which is based on something that really happened, which is that when they all thought they were dying, Fletcher sort of gives this sermon about Drake and how awful he's, you know, his terrible behaviour, everything he's done, you know, the thief, he's a murderer. He could have added slave trader to that, because that is how Drake's career started. And Drake has him excommunicated and sort of chained up to a hatch on the boat. And that comes from something that really happened. You know, Fletcher did give this extremely unwise speech, sort of railing against Drake, and he was imprisoned for it. And when they got home, Fletcher made it home. We don't know what happened to him after that. He kind of disappears from the record, and he had made a very, very powerful enemy in Drake. So yes, no, in short, I think it's worth remembering that you know, people in the past didn't always think completely different to us. Sometimes they did think, you know, these things that we now think are immoral were immoral then, and that's important to remember as well.
Definitely. Thank you. And Holly, anything comes out of yours in terms of sensitive subjects?
There are small things, but nothing with such power as what you have all just said, and I'm wary that we're getting close to the end. So that was just so interesting.
Yeah. So should we move on to some questions?
Yes, absolutely. I've been monitoring that while you've all been talking. Thank you all so much for that. I we'll just flip through some questions because I do want to allow people a chance to just grab something very quickly to eat before the next panel at 1:30. And by people, I mean me, obviously. Apologies for the one or two little patchy bits of audio from Louise F there, but on the whole, we were good. It was fine. Don't worry about it. Apologies for that if you had a problem with that. And hello to Francis's cat. There's a very grumbly cat. There's a question for Nikki from Margaret, who asks, I'm interested to know if you wrote in the first or the third person and what influenced your choice.
Well, I started in the third person. I got about 20,000 words in before I chucked it all out and wrote it again in the first. For me, it didn't actually feel like a choice at all. I was very self-conscious writing in the first person act first, which is why I'd started the book in the third. But actually, it made no sense. This is a book about this one particular woman. And once I sort of had done the research and I felt like I knew the story and I knew her voice, which I had sort of, as I mentioned, been inspired by reading the real words of real women in her situation, that made the first person the obvious choice. It does mean that I can't give readings because I don't sound in any way authentic or had a very sort of a Spanish accent, which I can't do. But yes, it didn't feel like a choice. It just felt like the right way to write the book.
Excellent, thank you. Chip also had a question for you, Nikki, and he asked, have you or anyone else researched whatever child or children Maria had after being abandoned in Indonesia, and might there be a story lurking there?
Someone did ask me, I won't say how my book ends, but the reality of the situation, probably, I mean, it's a very grim outlook, really, to be left on a desert island. In reality, she was left with 2 other men, and they were given seeds to sort of make a new life. They were given vessels for carrying water, but not actually water, because it was an island that had no natural water. So they were left with vessels to go and fetch water from another island. So the reality is that outlook is very, very bleak. And you know, just the statistics of women dying in childbirth alone are bleak and upsetting. But that particular circumstance, yeah, we don't know. And in fact, you know, as I say, I won't mention how my book ends, but it's a bleak outlook. Is all I can say.
Okay, let's leave it at that. Anybody can take this one from Donna. It must be tempting to put all your research into your novel. Did you have to do a lot of editing once you completed your first draft? I suspect you're all going to say the same thing here, but anybody wants to go with that one?
I would say about 95% of my research does not go into my book.
Would you all agree with that?
Nodding.
Lots of nodding there.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. Is it
lots of
go on. Is it a protracted editing process? And
yeah. For me, the editing was protracted more in terms of plot and character, not so much in research. I usually do just enough research to write what I need to write, and then if I need to do detailed research, I park it along the way and find it, because I think you can very easily, particularly if you're dealing with real life events, you can research yourself out of your story. If you come across something that means a person was in a place on a date where you need them to be somewhere else, and you do that in the beginning, then you go, okay, I can't tell this story then. Whereas if you do the story first, you'll find a way around it. And I don't mean you fictionalize it or change the history, but once you're committed to your story, you will find a way around that. So for me, the research actually is a process going along. I don't do tons of research beforehand. But personally, I don't like the kind of book where you realise the author's saying, I spent an afternoon on this and you're going to have it, whether it needs to be here or not. That's not my cup of tea. So it is a good idea just to put in exactly what you need.
Yeah, I would agree with that and say that actually the most important thing is the story. And I definitely got more efficient for my first book. I read so much before I even started writing, whereas now I'll do some general research just to get the story down and then research all the details at a later stage.
Thank you.
I think
Go on,
well,
Nikki.
nothing is wasted really, because when you do all of this research into stuff that doesn't make it into the book, it's kind of all up there in your subconscious, and it might come out in unexpected ways. You know, it might even be a word, it might be, you know, a throwaway sentence, but a lot of it comes out in ways that you hadn't expected.
Yes, I agree with that. And sometimes research you've done for one novel might spark another novel idea, which is excellent.
There's a question here from Tab. Unfortunately, they have had to leave before the end, but they're going to watch this back on our YouTube channel next week, so they will still get the answer to this question. Going on from the research question, were any authors in contact with historical advisors, e.g. for historical television? Even though it's a different medium, I know they look at the same questions of everyday life, which Frances was consulting. I wondered if they went through a similar process to fill in the gaps.
I didn't really do that, but what I find quite useful, if you've got a really niche question that you just know there's going to be someone who did a PhD on it and probably no one else knows the answer, and then I would tweet it and just ask for people to retweet, and always someone knows the answer. The most obscure thing, someone will know. Otherwise, you know, you could read 100 books and that detail might not be in there, but also that person's really pleased that that year they spent researching pockets in the 17th century has helped somebody else.
Twitter's a wonderful thing for that, isn't it? I use it all the time myself. Thank you. I just put a couple of notes in there. For Polly, there's a good book by Neil Spring called The Haunted Shore, which is based on Orford Ness. So if you haven't read it, there you go. It takes place on Orford Ness. And I also applauded Nikki because as the creator of a podcast, which is all about folklore. Yay, you mentioned folklore. Well done. Thank you very much. Louise C, referring to something that you said earlier, Frances, has just made the point that she's a wheelchair user and people treat you differently a lot. And we need to remember that you still have a brain regardless of anything else. It's a very good and valid point. Thank you, Louise. Gemma asks, how do you know when to, I'm a non-fiction author, this resonates with me. How do you know when to stop researching?
Very good.
Has anybody got a good answer? My answer would certainly be when I know how far it is from what I have written so far to my publisher's deadline and whether I'll be able to get the rest of it on in time. That's when you draw the line, but that's non-fiction is different.
I had to have the manuscript taken off me, really. I was still trying to make changes right towards the end. So I'm not qualified to answer that question.
I have visions of you hanging on to it as your agent is pulling it out of your hands. Yeah.
Something I learned from my first book was I did a lot of research, and then when copy edit stage, a lot of they questioned quite a lot of it, and I was like, I know this is right, but can I remember where I read that? So I've got much better at, documenting everything I saw it. So my top tip if you're writing historical fiction is absolutely keep records of where you've read everything.
Yeah.
I agree.
Absolutely. I think, yes, we've all shaken a fist at a copy editor in our time, one way or another. For me, it was somebody who reworded something that one of the characters said in something. I wrote a short story, which was fiction, but was based very much on research, the same as all your stuff. And the copy editor reworded what one of my characters said, despite the fact that those words came verbatim from a manuscript, but decided that they knew better. I changed it back. We will draw a line there, as we've all done with our research at one time or another. Lots of people have already said thank you very much in the chat for this panel and loved it very much. Do please, if you haven't already done so, show your appreciation in the chat window for Louise, Polly, Nikki and Frances, our historical fiction panel. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.